For centuries, knights were considered unbeatable, armored, mounted, heavily trained warriors, each worth about 10 common foot soldiers. And when these horsemen charged across battlefields, it seemed no army could stand before them. That is until one day when an army of farmers stood firm and not only defeated an entire knightly army, but even managed to kill more than 70 nobles and take 500 of their Golden Spurs as trophies. This was the battle that ended the supremacy of knights. And if you want to hear more stories about epic battles from history, don't forget to subscribe. Also, this is quite a long video with many different events, so timestamps will be in the description below if you want to skip to a certain part. Now let's go back to medieval Europe, where despite what romantic novels might make you believe, life for peasants was pure hell. They were dirt poor, horribly overtaxed, and treated as little more than property. Any ounce of free time they had left after working the fields was spent trying to survive in a village where a single outbreak of disease could wipe out half the population. But while they suffered under this terrible life, they watched as kings, queens, and nobles lived lives of luxury. In fact, during this time period, a noble was allowed to do whatever he wanted to his peasants, and they had no legal rights at all. So it should come as no surprise that when Count Louis de Nevers started heavily taxing his Flemish subjects and favoring the French over the native people, anger started boiling. The last straw came when Louis went to war against the city of Ghent, pillaging the surrounding countryside. After sending the women and children inside the city walls, the Count set fire to their homes, farms, and fields. It was then that the gents decided they had enough and would fight back. They elected a leader named Nicholas Zanakin and turned to arms. What followed was a decade of war between the oppressed peasants and the nobles known as the Flemish Rebellion, which lasted from 1323 to 1328. During this time, Zanakin and his peasant army took several important cities, but it was clear that they needed more help. So word spread throughout northern France and southern Netherlands, calling for the commoners to rise up against their oppressors. Subscribe for new stories. Men from all walks of life answered this call, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants alike banding together to form a disciplined fighting force. They elected leaders from among themselves and established a council to oversee military and civil affairs. Most importantly, they created a common identity for their movement, calling themselves the Men of Letters. It was an odd name for an army of peasants, but it perfectly captured the essence of their revolution, a chance for commoners to rise above their station and leave illiteracy behind. When faced with well-trained knights, however, they needed more than just numbers to win. Faced with an upcoming battle against the French royal army, they knew they needed a plan to beat the cavalry. So they did something brilliant. See, the area they chose to fight in was wet and marshy, which was perfect for their strategy. They had chosen an area near a small village called Bossu, located in the middle of a marsh surrounded by high ground. This meant that any cavalry attempting to charge would have to ride through a narrow path along the marsh. And there was only one way to get through, straight through their line of defense. And they made sure that this path was filled with spiked clubs called Golden Dag. This weapon looked kind of like a morning star or a mace, except it had spikes protruding outwards from all angles, making it almost impossible to defend against. In fact, this weapon would become so iconic that 100 years later, another peasant army would use it to great effect. But for now, it was 1302 and the French king, Philip IV, had assembled an army of 8,000 troops, including 2,500 elite knights who were eager to crush the rebels once and for all. He assigned command of this force to Count Robert II, who rode at the head of his knights, confident in his own prowess and eager for glory. But he was in for a big surprise. On the day of the battle, the French advanced across the open field towards the rebel lines. The sight that greeted them was confusing. All they saw were rows upon rows of commoners armed with pitchforks and clubs standing shoulder to shoulder behind a barricade. There was no sign of fear in their eyes, only steely determination. As the French drew closer, they noticed something even more peculiar. Not a single nobleman had entered the battlefield. Instead, Robert had withdrawn his infantry to the rear, leaving only his knights to face the music. This may seem like a smart move today, but remember, back then, knights were supposed to be invincible. And most importantly, the nobility liked taking credit for wins. By having his infantry hidden behind the scenes, Robert was giving his men a chance to claim all the glory for themselves. But unfortunately for him, this proved to be a terrible mistake. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the knights charged, riding through the water with lances held high. But before they could reach the other side, the golden dags started flying. One by one, knights were knocked off their horses, some impaled by the spikes, others beaten unconscious. More and more French knights fell until the river ran red with blood and littered with armor. Seeing this carnage, Robert ordered a retreat, which soon turned into a rout. French soldiers fled in all directions, tripping over one another in their haste to escape. In the end, over 70 nobles had been killed, most of them thrown into the river and drowned. And the victors took 500 golden spurs from the slain knights as trophies. This was a humiliating defeat and a wake-up call that peasants, when properly led and organized, could defeat the most powerful warriors of their age. Word of the Flemish victory spread like wildfire, inspiring other groups to rise up against their oppressors. In Bohemia, for example, a man named Jan Zika led the Hussites in several wars against the Holy Roman Empire. Like the Flemings, the Hussites were a mix of farmers, craftsmen, and other commoners who had had enough of being oppressed by the nobility and the church. Under Zika's leadership, they built large, disciplined armies, wore protective clothing, and used innovative tactics to defeat their opponents. They also used massive farm wagons called war wagons that could carry supplies and even troops, function as a siege engine, or be fortified and turned into a mobile castle. Using these tactics, they won many battles against the knights and established a republic that lasted for 70 years. The Flemings, on the other hand, enjoyed a brief window of prosperity and freedom after their victory at the Golden Spurs, which lasted until 1356, but their legacy far outlived their brief window of freedom. The English, for example, were also tired of living under the thumb of the aristocracy, and in 1381, the peasants rose up in what became known as the English Peasants' Revolt. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, the rebels marched on London, burning villages and manors along the way. While the revolt was eventually crushed, it put an end to the efforts by the nobility to restore full serfdom and made England a more modern and progressive country. So as you can see, the Flemish victory at the Battle of the Golden Spur was far from an isolated incident. In fact, it marked the beginning of a long process that led to the decline of feudalism and the rise of more modern forms of government and society. But how did this happen? How could a ragtag group of farmers defeat some of the most highly trained warriors of their day? Well, there are a few reasons for this. First, the Flemings had the advantage of numbers. They also had the benefit of good planning and organization. They planned ahead, chose their battles wisely, and used the terrain to their advantage. Finally, they refused to accept defeat and were willing to fight to the death. They knew that if they didn't stand firm, their oppressors would simply grind them down and take away everything they had. The result was a devastating defeat for the French and a resounding victory for the Flemings. The Battle of the Golden Spurs was a watershed moment in history, ending the myth of knightly invincibility. But it was just one battle in a much longer war, one that would ultimately result in the Flemish people gaining their freedom and dignity. In the end, the Flemish militias laid the foundation for a series of prosperous trading cities that would eventually become the heart of Europe's commercial network. And their defiance showed that true power lies not with those born to privilege, but with those willing to stand up for what they believe in, no matter how stacked the deck may be against them. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and watch another one.